It's hard to wrap your head around the full horror of World War II. Yes, we've seen the numbers, and we've read the history books, but when you start to look beyond the statistics, it becomes something else entirely. Take Auschwitz, for example. Officially, about 1.3 million people died there. It's one of the most infamous concentration camps in history, and rightfully so. But there was another camp. The name is less often mentioned in history class, but one that was whispered with pure terror, even by the prisoners of Auschwitz. That camp is called Mauthausen. Mauthausen was a German concentration camp located in Austria, just about 150 kilometers west of Vienna. By the numbers, the death toll there was around 100,000, which was a staggering number. Yet, it doesn't even come close to Auschwitz on paper. And still, survivors described Mauthausen as far worse. In January 1941, the Nazis officially labelled Mauthausen as a camp of no return, which was not just a metaphor. If you were sent there, you weren't coming back, and everyone knew it. Over 200,000 people were deported to this 15-hectare death zone. More than half never made it out alive, but the story of Mauthausen is not about numbers. This place wasn't just built to imprison, it was built to annihilate. Welcome to Unveiled History. It began quietly enough. On March 12, 1938, Germany took control of Austria, incorporating it into its territory, an action they called Anschluss, a German term for connection or union. Barely 2 weeks later, in the region of Upper Austria, Nazi leader August Eigruber proudly told a cheering crowd that his district would build a concentration camp. The masses cheered, caught up in the spectacle, unaware of the grim shadow his words cast. The chosen location was a small town on the banks of the Danube, Mauthausen. Two powerful Nazi officials, Oswald Pohl, head of the SS Administration Office, and Theodor Eicke, inspector of concentration camps, visited the area almost immediately. These were men who had the German Nazi politician Heinrich Himmler's absolute trust, men tasked with turning the SS into a self-sustaining war machine. The massive granite quarries on the edge of the town drew them in. You see, Adolf Hitler and his chief architect Albert Speer had huge ambitions. More than planning a war, they were planning a reconstruction of the entire German Reich. Cities were to be reshaped, monuments raised, and a new empire built in stone. That kind of construction required more granite than the country's industry could supply. And so, standing among the stone pits of Mauthausen, Pohl and Ecker saw an opportunity. They needed a workforce. Not paid labourers, but prisoners. A disposable, voiceless, rightless workforce that could be exploited to the last breath. They didn't need to look far. The SS had already begun weaponising concentration camps for forced labour, and now, with the annexation of Austria, they had a new territory to expand that system. By August 8, 1938, just 5 months after the Anschluss, the first prisoners arrived in Mauthausen. 300 men transferred from Dachau, another concentration camp in Germany. Most of them were labelled criminals, marked by green triangles sewn onto their uniforms. But they weren't hardened murderers or violent gang members. Most had been convicted of petty offences, things like stealing food or being unemployed. To the SS, their crime didn't matter. Their value lay in their labour and ultimately their disposability. But by 80 SS men from the Dachau Totenkopfverbände, the Death Head units. These were the elite enforcers of Nazi terror, trained to crush resistance and show no mercy. Their orders were quite simple. Build the camp with your own hands. Then, dig stone until you die. At first, Mauthausen was small, 4 wooden barracks surrounded by fences and watchtowers. But it grew fast. By December 38th, just 4 months later, the camp held nearly 1,000 prisoners. 13 had been released, but 34 were already dead, and this was just the beginning. Now, despite being built and controlled by the Nazi regime, Mauthausen wasn't actually founded by the German government, at least not directly. It was created under the guise of a business, DEST, Deutsche Erd- und Steinwerke GmbH, German Earth and Stoneworks. This was a private company formed by the SS to manage slave labour-driven industries, including the quarries. Oswald Pohl, the same SS officer who scouted Mauthausen, was also in charge of Dest. In 1938, Dest leased the quarries from the city of Vienna, officially turning the entire operation into a for-profit venture built on forced labour. The goal wasn't just to punish the enemies of the Reich, it was to profit from their suffering. And where did the funding come from? Not just Nazi coffers. It came from Dresdner Bank, one of Germany's largest banks providing commercial loans, the Prague-based Bohemische Bank, and even the German Red Cross, an organisation meant to offer aid. But perhaps the darkest source of funding was the Reinhardt Fund, money stolen from the very prisoners who were brought to the camps. Gold fillings ripped from mouths, wedding rings taken off dead fingers, family heirlooms looted from luggage. All were converted into capital to build more barracks, more camps, and more deaths. By 1939, the Dest company expanded its ambitions. A second camp was built just a few kilometers away, Gusen. Like Mauthausen, Gusen would become a site of unspeakable torment. Together, they formed the heart of what would become one of the most brutal slave labour systems in Nazi-occupied Europe, and all of it began with one cold calculation: we need stone, let them die for it. By the early 1940s, the name Mauthausen had already begun to spread fear far beyond Austria's borders. Unlike other concentration camps, which are classified under different categories based on their intended use, Mauthausen was placed in Category 3, the most severe and deadly classification in the entire Nazi camp system. It was a label that meant one thing: prisoners sent here were not expected to survive. In fact, many prisoners arrived with their files stamped RU, Rückkehr unerwünscht. It means return undesirable, a code for they are not coming back. Prisoners were sorted into different categories, with each treated with varying degrees of inhumanity. But one group became especially notorious: the Punishment Battalion. These were the men sent to work in the granite quarries under the most extreme conditions. At the heart of this horror was the infamous Todesstiege, the Stairway of Death. 186 stone steps carved from the cliffside led from the granite quarry below to the camp above. Each day, prisoners were forced to carry heavy blocks of stone, sometimes weighing over 100 pounds, up these treacherous steps. In the heat of the summer or the freezing wind of winter, undernourished and exhausted bodies climbed the stairway again and again, with the SS watching closely, ready to punish any stumble. The stairs were narrow, uneven, and slick with blood, sweat, and stone dust. Prisoners often fell, their heavy loads crashing down on those behind them. The slightest show of weakness invited savage beatings. The guards' cruelty was not physical, it was psychological. They nicknamed the men they forced off the cliffs Fallschirmspringer, parachutists, a grotesque joke for victims hurled to their deaths. As one survivor later described, it was a place of physical and mental torture and abuse beyond our imaginations. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Infections, lice, and disease were rampant. But for the SS, this wasn't a failure. If an SS doctor declared you arbeitsunfähig, unfit for work, you were taken away and killed. Some were injected with phenol or petrol, others were given air injections to the heart. Some were shot. No trial, no explanation, no mercy. As the number of those deemed useless began to rise, the SS found themselves needing a faster way to kill. And so, in the autumn of 1941, a gas chamber was built at Mauthausen. At first, it was used to execute the sick and disabled prisoners who could no longer be worked to death, but soon, its use expanded to mass killings. By the spring of 1942, the SS added a new method: a gas van. Prisoners were loaded into a sealed compartment at the back of the truck. Then, as the van drove towards Gusen, exhaust fumes were piped into the cabin, slowly suffocating everyone inside. It wasn't until late 1943 that the SS made a significant shift. As the war intensified and Germany's need for weapons and supplies skyrocketed, the Nazi regime realised something chilling: dead prisoners don't produce bombs. So, the camp's role changed. Prisoners were no longer just meant to die, they were now expected to serve the war effort before dying. By the end of 1943, Mauthausen held around 25,000 prisoners. But as Nazi war efforts intensified, so did their reliance on forced labour. Within a single year, that number tripled, ballooning to over 74,000 by the end of 1944. By March 1945, the camp reached its horrific peak. 84,000 people were crammed into a system built for suffering. Altogether, over 200,000 individuals were imprisoned in the Mauthausen system. That number includes thousands who were murdered on arrival without even being registered, and among them, 8,000 women who were held in what remained a men's camp. But in the final months of the war, Mauthausen's purpose shifted again. No longer just a place for slave labour in the Nazi arms industry, it became a holding depot for those evacuated from Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen, Ravensbrück, and other collapsing camps in the east. The result was catastrophic. Camp overflowed, tents were set up for at least 10,000 prisoners, many of them ill, skeletal, and barely alive. Even as Allied forces closed in, Mauthausen kept murdering. The gas chamber ran until April 28, 1945, just days before liberation. That same day, over 30 Austrian socialists and communists were gassed. And just a week earlier, on Hitler's birthday, April 20th, the SS marked the occasion by selecting 3,000 sick inmates for execution. Even the crematoriums couldn't keep up with the mounting dead. The camp smelled of burning flesh, unburied corpses, and decay. By May 3rd, as the SS realised the war was lost, they fled, but not before executing any prisoner who had worked closely with the camp operations, men whose knowledge of the inner workings posed a threat. The final execution took place that same day. Supervision of the camp was briefly passed to Vienna's fire brigade, and the prisoners began to organise. Committees formed in secret, readying for the liberation they dared to believe might come. On May 5th, 1945, the village of Mauthausen was occupied by American forces. That afternoon, Louis Hefliger, a delegate of the international community of the Red Cross, led 2 American armoured vehicles to the gates of the camp. But to the prisoners' horror, the soldiers left after a few hours, prompting panic. Many feared the SS would return. Some even armed themselves to prepare for a final, desperate defence. But they wouldn't need to. On May 7th, the 11th Armoured Division of General Patton's 3rd Army arrived for good. Mauthausen was finally liberated. Photographs taken that day show skeletal survivors standing beneath a giant banner. Spanish anti-fascists greet the Allied forces. If you really enjoyed this video, kindly support this channel by liking the video and hitting the subscribe button, and tell us your thoughts about this event in the comments section. Stay tuned for more videos.